radical fun. Okay. And we are going to be looking at the work of four kinds of people. Archigram, acoustics actually we are not looking at, so I should remove it. I removed it. Again, back to that lovely timeline that we've been looking at. We've gone through almost everything on this timeline here. We've been through all of this stuff and we are left with only archigram. Yeah. What's important about to understand about the 60s, especially in Europe and America, that it was a time for this really kind of free life, free living, free love. Drugs were in the air. There was a very intense sort of movement to break earlier rules, to break earlier imaginations of what is right and wrong. In many ways, there was a revolutionary fervor in the air that was about challenging everything that the parents really very often represented. And you saw the Situationists really kind of trying to kind of break those rules in one way. Today, we are going to look at architects and thinkers who are trying to also do similar things, but do it with a sense of humor. Okay. We're going to start off with these. This is fundamentally what we're going to start off with, which is a book written by Rayner Banham in 1960. Rayner Banham, if you remember, was the guy who actually put together actually two essays. We'll be looking at this theory and design in the first machine age and the house is not a home, 1960 and 1965. Rayner Banham, if you remember, was the one who actually coined the term brutalism in the when we were talking about the work of Peter and Alison Smithson. But he moves away from the imagination of brutalism and starts thinking about new ideas for what architecture can be. And theory and design in the first machine age is one of the first meditations that he has on the relationship between technology and architecture. Okay. He says that what has happened is the idea of technology has been reduced to functionalism, okay, especially after the war. He says technology wasn't about function, for God's sake, right? It's like a stupid imagination कि function को लेकर उसे form दे दिया तो यार correct होता है. He says that even if you look at things like the great Barcelona Pavilion and the Villa Savoy, okay, it wasn't functionalism that was making it beautiful. Okay, if you start talking about Villa Savoy and Barcelona Pavilion, you remember those buildings through the idea of function, आधा तो उसका beauty or forgotten. Okay, he says the great modern architects were not interested in functionalism. Le Corbusier wasn't interested in functionalism. Mies van der Rohe wasn't interested in functionalism. They were both trying to create a formal symbolism of technology. They were trying to make an architecture that represented the idea of the new age, the new machine age. Okay. And if you look at the work of Mies, you'll realize that these are not necessarily functional buildings, but they look like they're about a certain time, a certain kind of technology, glass and steel and the relationship with nature outside. The next essay that he writes in 1965 is a very famous essay that's called "A Home is Not a House." Okay. And look at a sentence within it. He says, when your house contains such a complex of pipings, flues, ducts, wires, lights, inlets, outlets, etc., etc., okay, when it contains so many services that the hardware could stand up by itself without any assistance from the house, why have a house to hold it up at all? Fundamentally, वो बोल रहा है कि हमारे घरों में इतने सारे gadgets हैं. For everything there is a gadget. Then why do you need the building? So he's asking for an architecture that completely gets rid of the building entirely until all you're left with is a freestanding machine as the building. And this is what he calls the anatomy of a dwelling. From the TV antenna to bathroom plumbing to telephone cables, he said this is what architecture is. In other words, he is actually saying that services is architecture. It's an interesting argument that he's making, and he goes ahead and then talks about like a car that can then turn, the fact that it's pure machine is what architecture can be. And these were ideas that a group in London called Archigram were excited by. There was a sort of air in London at that time at the Architectural Association London, which is a school of architecture, where these six men came together and formed this group called Archigram. Now, Archigram is like the kind of people who are really interested in things like the machine age, the science fiction imagination of the world, because that was the space age, right? People had gone to the moon and people were able to walk. travel around the world, and suddenly they were thinking, हमारे architecture इतना pre-modernist tradition के बारे में क्यों बात करता है? He says that what we should be doing is that we need to make an architecture that is of today, that is dealing with the new technologies that we have around us. And in that, we need to break these stupid boundaries. Like, ये high art है, ये low art है, ये बहुत कीमती है and this is kitsch, or ये this is real and that is fake. So they are putting together arguments that are about breaking again the idea of right and wrong that came from, let's say, their fathers. Banham said this about them. Hard it as may be for the average kind of Phil from Gothenburg or some general person to comprehend Archigram's work, he means, it's all done for the giggle. In a sense, he's saying they're making jokes. Okay, people draw a big distinction between projects and buildings, but I don't. Okay, and Peter Cook himself, who's one of the big six of Archigram, says a lot of our projects are highly serious and a lot of our built buildings are a sort of, bad joke. So Archigram really began stuff as a tiny little magazine. There were 9 such magazines that were made from 1961 to 1974. Okay. And a magazine bhi nahi bol sakte, they're literally like pamphlets. Like this over here is the first handmade, literally pamphlet that was made. And in this pamphlet, you can see the form of the writing and the form of the image making. There is I will break all the rules. I don't give two hoots as to what the rules of printing are. Look at the way that the text itself is moving around, different kinds of handwritten collages that are all over the place. Literally playing around with the form itself. There were literally 2 sheets of paper that were stapled, and this little red dot was made by a potato. ऐसे डालते ना. Okay. Only 400 of these were created. Obviously, these are very rare right now. And in it, they come up with ideas to really challenge some of the presumptions of modern planning. This is an exhibition that they put together in 1963 that is called the Living City. And in this, they say that, those Siam ka jo 4 different categories are all faltu. He says the problem facing our cities is not of their regeneration, but just of their right to existence. Okay. And in this, they go ahead with kind of making an exhibition that is around these themes. These are some of the collages from the theme. And again, that completely wild, crazy sort of way in which they're thinking about formatting things. Right? Look at that logo also, which is like a car, the Living City logo. That's not the right side. Living City was not about the form of cities, but rather the formlessness of space and time. So it was like, when we live in the world, we are not living based on the sort of very clear divisions of Siam. We are living in this sorts of formlessness. And I think that's a really important thing to start thinking about. The idea of the formless, that which lies outside conventional ideas of form. This is the exhibition kind of pavilion that they did, and they created these so-called gloops. Gloops, I'll show them to you. These sort of zones within which the categories that they made were things like place, situation, remember the Situationists, communication, movement, crowd, group, man, and this was the structure itself, a sort of general sort of triangulated surface within which these spaces existed. And in each of these spaces, there was a set of collages around this idea of themes. Now this, and you had this sort of these kinds of images that were there, right? And they also brought up the idea of the situation, like the Situationists. They said the situation was an ideas generator in creating a living city. Cities should generate, reflect, and activate life. They're an environment organized to precipitate life and movement. Situation, the happenings within the spaces in the city, the transient throwaway objects, the passing presence of cars and people are important, possibly more important than the built demarcation of space. You can see their attention is not towards the building, which they say is like whatever, but their attention is towards everything that is moving, shifting, creating sort of situations around us. And each of those surfaces was cast like this. These images that came from high culture, from low culture, from the world around, all coming together to form this sort of kind of spatial experience. And of course, text itself used very much as image within the exhibition. In fact, one of the images that they also use is this one over here, this tiny one here. If you guys remember from last week, Guy Debord's The Naked City image. This is the Naked City image that is used as part of that entire exhibition. So you can see where they are inspired by. I just love these sorts of crazy drawings, but look at the kinds of sentences. Is the key to the formal problem? Is it moving things from place to place? Is it feeding the services? It's all happening. It's all happening. The city is tight and free, and they make kinds of these propositions of cities that are then laid along this long line that is literally straddling the world. And we'll see some of those imaginations of cities. They also have everyday life and its objects just put together as part of the exhibition itself. This is called the Living City Survival Kit. And in it you have, Playboy magazine, a jazz record, and of course toothpaste, alcohol, the stuff that is imagined that इस शहर में रहने के लिए ये basics है. And as you can see, it's very much embracing of commodity culture, unlike the Situationists. In some way, they seem to be perfectly happy with Coca-Cola bottles and Nescafe, as long as they are able to celebrate their lives within this new city. I'm going to show you some of the images of Archigram magazine, just to show you the way that they were literally lifting off and playing with existing popular culture images. Like this obviously takes up from a superhero comic book. And in this entire superhero comic book, you have a story that's being told, in a comic book form. Very, very influenced by science fiction. There are bubbles up in the sky, you have wheels up in the sky, tubes, capsules. It's all about zoom styling, and they are not afraid of styling. They are very, very happy with the ideas of styling. You have Superman, that's of course here because of course he's the one who could fly. They also come up with, within the magazines, they come up with particular ideas for what a future Archigram city can be. I'm going to show you two in detail and one very quickly. This is called Plug-in City. Highly inspired by the Japanese metabolists, you may ask, where there is a basic infrastructure that is created, and to which all of these different sorts of modules come and get plugged in. But while the Japanese in many ways were kind of serious about the possibilities of that city, with Archigram it is really just a lot of playful plastic fun. These are more images. You can see the basic tree of the infrastructure, and all these are different formations around it. And some of them have these stars with these capsules that are all attached on the sides. The scaffolding, three-dimensional. There's a plaza up in the sky. Everyone lives up here. You have exhibitions. A three-dimensional nature for the building itself. I'm going to just bombard you with images. You all can take a closer look later on. They go into extreme detail also about how to design them, how the scaffolding is designed, what is the nature of the unit itself. You can clip on a bedroom. You can clip on a bathroom, a kitchen, etc. This is that tower building with the central tower with the staircase and the lifts, and these are all units that are then attached radially around the center. Pretty much looks like the Kishore Kurokawa's kind of tower, right? That one, the capsule tower. This is the other crazy city that they designed. This is called Walking City. It's imagined that a self-contained city would then move around the world, done by Ron Heron. These are large, I guess, things for it to walk around on, and it's obviously solar powered. You get the solar panels on the upper area. There are lots of these. If you go there, Archigram has an online archive, and there are an incredible number of images there. I had to know when to stop. I just kept collecting them because I like drawing, so I like good. So I collect these drawings. They're these beautiful, crazy drawings, and there's some sort of idea of resolving it. 220 meters, 400 meters. The architecture is in some ways resolved, in some way. And photo montages, of course, that are using popular culture, fashion models as ways of showing what the architecture can be. This is the Walking City in Egypt. You see the Sphinx and the poor little pyramids that are down there. Another city that they imagined is this one called Instant City, 1968. And it's interesting to say, before it was a sleepy town, then this entire Instant City came and it laid down these things and started literally kind of polluting the space underneath. And this is when that entire city came alive with all these incredible activities. And once these entire activities had infiltrated the city, it then moved away and a network system started taking over the older city. This is the city at its highest intensity. So you have, discos and outdoor theaters, etc. Then invade this city. Another kind of instant city, which is being carried on with these. Another image of instant city going around the world. The photo montage is a preferred mode of representation, as you can see. Another image of instant city from 1970. So these cities were, they kept evolving them across that entire history of archigram. This is the last of the cities I'll be showing you, I think. This is called Computer City. And over here, the entire city is based on the network of information. That is all that matters. And in some ways, for me, it really reminded me of the idea of the internet, where the city is really just a mess of modules with networks that are all connected to each other, and a hierarchy within that in terms of which is the first area, the second area, etc. And they even use words as nets to talk about it. And this is really 1964, so it's in the early years, I guess you could say, of the internet. There were also buildings that they made as these ideas of inflatable things that people can carry with them. So these were not cities, but rather homes. This is called the Kushikal and the Sutaloon. I'm just going to show you one of them in a little more detail, which is this one. The Sutaloon, 1967. You have this idea of sexual liberation where you can have sex with whomever you want to outside and do not be constrained by imaginations of marriage or heterosexuality. So you have this guy who's carrying this entire suit that he can just use, that a woman can enter and he can have sex with her and then leave. So it's sort of transient, I guess you could call it prosthetics that you can wear for sex and sexual liberation. Here you have these images. The other one is the Kushikul. I don't know too much about it, so I won't talk too much. I'm sure you can find out more about it on the internet. This is an inflatable suit home that was made in 1968. That in some ways reminds me of the idea of the Sutaloon. Okay. This is a much later building. This is in Graz, designed by Peter Cook, one of the buildings that was designed by members of Archigram. As you can see, it is a very strange looking object that recalls animals and spaceships and I don't know what else, aliens perhaps, landing in the heart of the city of Graz. You look at the older fabric around it and you have this strange object right in the center. But yet the strange object sits embedded almost at the same height as the rest of the city. This is 2003. The plan is very simple. You come inside, look at the way that the building, this wild form, is embedded within the existing architecture. You come up and it's upstairs that it kind of begins to make its own thing. This is the ground level. You come up directly into the heart of this, which is the exhibition area, and the surrounding is just embedded within the older fabric of the building. So from the street itself, the scale of the building stays constant. This is a cutaway axonometry. The external skin that draws in light onto the inside. From the city street, you see it's slightly bulging, like a strange animal has landed. So there's humor very much even in this building, kinky, weird kind of humor. At night, the surface is lit up dazzling in this kind of strange way. The skin. And this bar where you can stand and look at the world outside. So that's it as far as Archigram is concerned, but we still have a bunch of people to go through. So the next person who we will be looking at is a man called Cedric Price, who had a close relationship with many of the people in Archigram although he wasn't directly involved with the group itself. But you can see the way that ideas from Archigram and how influenced him, and how his ideas also influenced Archigram. But because in the same year as Plugin City, Walking City, Computer City, and all were put together, he came up with an idea for Fun Palace. Fun Palace was supposed to be an interactive and adaptable educational complex like Instant City somewhere in London. It was to be built on land that was not used, and it was imagined that it would just be a large scaffolding that would go across a large area. And inside that area, you would have the possibilities of creating all kinds of different activities. Choose what you want to do or watch someone else do it. Learn how to handle tools, paint, babies, machinery, or just listen to your favorite tune. Dance, talk, or be lifted to where you can see how other people make things work. Sit out over space with a drink and tune into what's happening elsewhere in the city. Try starting a riot or beginning a painting, or just lie back and stare at the sky. The Fun Palace Manifesto is: we believe in the genius in everyone an artist and everyone a scientist, and that creativity and community can change the world for the better. We believe we can do this together locally with a radical fun, and that anyone, anywhere can make a fun palace. So there is a joyous pleasure in culture and creativity that is supposed to be enabled by the Fun Palace. This is the architecture for the Fun Palace. A traveling crane that can move things, projection screens on all sides, a restaurant that can move, escalators and staircases that can take you up to another level, and below ground is where all the services are, tucked away, so you never see them. Some drawings. This is the helicopter view of Fun Palace. The details of the plans and all the various things that are plugged in, including people and things, etc. Kind of coming into here. You can see a little gym that's here. The plan, as it were. These are all the services on both sides, leaving the entire area centrally open, and you have these swiveling partitions that can constantly make new spaces move up and down into different areas itself. A drawing of the way that it was imagined, and you can see that crazy scaffolding on all sides, and all people doing all kinds of wild things inside here. Now, if this building probably reminded you a lot of another building that was built a few years later and was, almost directly inspired by the idea of the Fun Palace, which is the Pompidou Center in Paris by Richard Rogers and Renzo Piano. Again, these two were not directly part of the Archigram sort of team, but you can see this idea of flexibility, playfulness, services, the Rainer Banham's idea of the home is not a house, and services as the architecture. You can see that all demonstrated in the work of Richard Rogers and Renzo Piano. This is the Pompidou Center in Paris. You all probably have seen this somewhere before. This is the city of Paris. This machine apparatus has landed on the streets of Paris. An aerial view where all the services are then placed on the outside for display in this kind of really vibrant color like blue, yellow, red, and green. A scaffolding on both the edges that holds up simple floor plates. Even the movement is taken to the outside core. So this is the large escalator that moves up and takes you to the different floors. See the plan, all the services on both sides, movement on the outside, and the entire floor plate is empty for setting up of art exhibitions in the section as well. And it's the lower area where all the parking, etc. happens, making a large plaza from where you can see it. So the building actually is very sensitive to context in a strange way, because it definitely follows the street line here. It doesn't try to overpower its neighbors in the height, at least. It tries to keep the scale of the streets, right? And it also makes two plazas, one plaza here, and it steps back to create another plaza up in front. Question, of course, is that it depends on how people would see the idea of context. This has more details of the steelwork and the way that things were held up. The size of those huge steel members holding it up. This is from the plaza looking at the city, and you can imagine it as a fun palace where all this plaza becomes the location for all these crazy people to do crazy things. Dance performances, fashion shows in front of the building, behind the building. The lower floor opens out to the plaza in front. This is from upstairs looking down at the plaza where something seems to be happening, and that's the escalator traveling up. Rogers' celebration of technology continues even in some of his later work. This is in the 1980s. This is Lloyds of London, and where you can see the celebration of technology not as an image of the future, as the image of contemporary life, where the services are all taken out to the outside of the building. These are the staircases and the toilets and the lift codes, all pulled to the outside and clad in this metal so that they literally glimmer and glimmer as they rise into the sky. Okay. Well, so you can see that in the plan. The plan is kind of simple square, and all the service cores are pulled out, and these service cores then kind of form the external edge of the building. Inside the building, there's an atrium that climbs up all the floors. You come inside from here, you go down, you come into the space. This atrium opens out, and you have that empty floor plates. All the services are on the edge of the building. This is the internal volume, and you can see the fact that even in the details, there's an attempt to show the building as if it's made up of parts, as if it's assembled together out of all these different parts, like Meccano or like some sort of game, Lego. It looks like another, I mean, it could be a services tower, right? But it's an office building. This is the atrium from above. And some of the details on the edges, again, Kishore Kurokawa's, reminds me a little of Kishore Kurokawa's imagination of buildings. Look at these way that these details come together. If you go back and look at the Japanese metabolists, you'll see a lot of similarities in the way that the buildings express themselves. This actually, I will not talk about this project, but actually maybe I will. This is much later. Again, technology as a way of talking about democracy. Within the old Reichstag in Berlin in the 90s, he inserts a dome at the back and on the top to replace the more historical dome. And what you can do is you can actually walk into that dome as a spiral, Richard Rogers again, and you can look down upon the acts, upon the people who are making decisions concerning the democracy. So you can actually stand up here and you can look down into this at the main council chamber itself. This is the Reichstag dome, again, Richard Rogers. Sorry, Norman Foster. Sorry, this is Norman Foster, not Richard Rogers, right? This is the plan itself, and this is the dome on top. So Richard Rogers, Norman Foster, all are looking at ways of celebrating technology as an expression of modernity, glass and steel structure. This is the inside space, and below this glass dome is where you can see the council chamber. But there have also been people who've been more kind of, let's say, purely experimental, not necessarily interested in building, but using drawing as a way of making an argument. This is a group that can be called Archizoom, working at very similar times, 1966 to 1974, but this time in Italy. Okay, Yonah Friedman abhi nahi aayega. Mistake. Actually, sorry, मैंने skip किया क्या? Sorry, I'm going to. Oh yeah, sorry. I'm starting with Friedman first. My mistake. So a man called Yonah Friedman, who was older than most of the group of the Archigram people, he also was interested in similar ideas that you could see in the Situationists. I'm not going to go too much into his work because very often I'll be repeating much of the things that happened earlier. But I just wanted to show you the fact that this particular time period was a time when freedom was a really important part of the way that architecture was imagined, and a freedom very often to allow people to have fun. While the Situationists were looking at fun as a revolutionary kind of idea, with Archigram and with many people, it was merely an expression of one's individuality. This is what he called spatial city, which again, as you can see, a scaffolding that rises above the cities within which he creates a whole system of ways of inhabiting these different spaces where people could come and make the city, make the homes based on whatever they needed. Another image of the way that that city sits over it. If you remember the Situationists' plans, very similar. But far more architectonic in some way than the Situationists. The drawings again have that similar playful quality that you find in Archigram's work, or for that matter, New Babylon, the images of New Babylon by Constant. Okay. What is interesting about Friedman is that he also designed a building in India, which was a small little experimental building built in bamboo. So he was interested in looking at the way that bamboo and materials can be used to create an architecture for societies that are not necessarily Western. This, for example, you are able to see the way that he's trying to evolve a spatial system that's based on domes and modules that can be inspired by traditional Islamic architecture. So he called all of this spatial infrastructure, a multi-story spatial grid into which people can come and insert things. I have again too many images merely because I like images. So this is the building that he built in Chennai. This is called the United Nations University, a center to really talk about different kinds of materials and how they can be used to create lightweight structures. You can see sustainability is an important part of the way that Friedman imagines the role of architecture. These are some of the drawings that he makes of these various sorts of domes that can be made upon a basic structure that's there below. He uses modular systems that are constantly repeating to create these systems. You can see the idea of biology again as part of the inspiration for many of these buildings. And it's called the Museum of Simple Technologies, which he says this is a very simple technology but can be used to create incredibly complex architectures. Look at the patterns of those domes over there, for example. And these are a few photographs I found of the building. I don't know whether it still exists. In fact, I only discovered it last week, so I have no idea. But the way that bamboo, etc., and cane are used to create the structures, I found to be fascinating. Shirish, do you know anything more about this building?
Yeah,
or no?
Rohan, can you hear me?
Yes.
I'm audible. Okay. He also created a manual, okay, which was a series of drawings to use a sort of harness wind energy, okay, and turn it into potential energy and kinetic energy kind of this thing, which was similar to what you are showing over here. It's a small manual, an A5 size manual, which was created, and then he imagined that these setups would be across the entire coastline of India. So in that manual, there are references to, okay, if you are on the coast of Maharashtra side, what will happen if you're on the coast of, so that kind of distinction became important for him. In his work, of course, I find just like Buckminster Fuller, the idea of efficiency is very, very critical. So he's imagining these floating cities also to let the land be, and let it grow into forests and things like that while we inhabit above it. I thought that was the
group that I was talking about earlier, before I realized you're going doing Friedman before, is a group called Archizoom. And this group called Archizoom started off with another group called Super Architectura. And these groups were making kind of architecture that, little installations that look like this. What is interesting about these installations is that they are full of color, pop culture references, plasticky, playful. Look at that kind of entire way in which this thing comes together, right? A celebratory, if you think about this in relationship with, let's say, the work of Mies van der Rohe, for example, you can see there's an anti-modernist aesthetic that is very much part of what they are trying to do. Even the clothes people are wearing, and people seem to be kind of enjoying themselves here. And they put together these drawings that have become very influential. This is what they called continuous movement architectural model for total urbanization. In some ways, these were supposed to be ironic takes on what was happening to the world today at that time. that as if there was this world of a perpetual city that seemed to be going all over the world. And this perpetual city was literally like a grid that could transcend across horizons. And inside this, people could be free. It goes everywhere. You see this kind of cool glass, or I don't know what material actually. I guess glass, cuboid that is just running across the entire world, across mountains, across seas, into swamps that runs along it. Semi-ironical, but also in some ways critical of the way that they were critiquing architecture. So they created also what is called the no-stop city as an instrument of making freedom. So this is a city that just goes like the city just goes everywhere. This is the plan of the city. This is a mountain. These are all service cores. Okay, and in that there's just a perpetual empty field that goes on forever and ever and ever. So ideas of property, ideas of right and wrong, ideas of inside outside are all disappeared because there is only a perpetual inside, or I guess a perpetual outside. And in this you have these squiggles of things that could become some infrastructure, some spaces, or some space creating devices. The images that they made look like this, where they put the scaffolding above, the structure above and below, creating two planes that just framed an endless horizon that went from one end to the other. And you had people who then could move freely within that space. Another image of such a sort of imagination, naked men and women of voice. So in some ways, it's almost a recall back to primitive life that happens once the city takes over the entire world. This is Archizone. What's important here is the idea that there seems to be at some point over here an ecological argument also that is at place about the fact that if human beings begin to start taking over the entire world, then what happens to nature? And the argument is being made to start thinking about creating densities within which human beings will live, and nature to be left pristine and empty. In fact, that is the argument that is taken up by this man called Paolo Soleri in the last of today's examples. He comes up with a book that is called Arcology, the City in the Image of Man, Paolo Soleri. This is the book itself. Okay. I have this book at home. It's like literally this big, like 4 feet or some shit like that. It's a huge book. and in it what he does, he puts together 30 possible what he calls arcologies, so 30 possible imaginations of cities, which are city-sized organisms that will then populate the entire world. I'm showing it to you primarily because of the drawings as well, because you will see the nature of the drawing is very different, but the argument in some ways is taking the idea that comes from people like Archigram about a city that contains everything, and it's moving it and it's trying to kind of find ways of articulating that given the ecological nature of the world. So this is what they imagine, that all of this will be inhabited. This is the United States of America, and all of these will be holes that are left over for the natural. Now the thing is that I have a feeling that a lot of this argument that's being made is made as critique. It's being made as an argument against the way that urbanization is currently happening in the world. It's a way to kind of bring to our notice the horrific ways in which the natural habitat was being exploited at that time. So what he does is that he presents he creates this entire dark area which he calls ecumenopoly. It's the universal city. And he says the holes are the areas where the earth breathes and renews itself, a map of despair. He forecasts a continent transformed into a human backyard. And with this, he starts kind of putting together 30 different imaginations for what can happen in these black spaces. I won't take you through the details, but the argument is this: is that arcology is the city in the image of man. Okay, and the city must be predicated on compactness. Lack of compactness is a lack of efficiency. A functionally weak system is the worst foundation for a complex society. In the three-dimensional city, and this is an important one for him, that we are very often thought of things in plan. What we need to think of is in things of 3 dimensions, so that the land can then continue to be free. Like how Shirish said, this guy is, what's his name? Paolo Soleri, not Paolo Soleri. What is his name? Yeah, Shirish. Ha, damn. Yonah Friedman's argument was.
Yonah Friedman.
Yonah Friedman. Sorry. So this idea of three-dimensionality must becomes key of it, and these are some of the drawings that he makes. There are 30 such drawings and 30 such cities that are there. If you look closely, they are supposedly completely dissolved. You have, for example, you have the ocean here on the edge. You have a beach, then you have living areas, you have a public promenade that encircles things. You have living neighborhoods that are all in these petals. You have light wells, because this is three-dimensional, you have to remember. You have towers that go up and down. Again, you have a public realm, then you have a vertical takeoff for an airport, and you have a city center right here at the center. This is the section of that same city, Nova, and you have this whole long note that goes about describing everything. It has the population, the density, the height is 1,000 meters, is basically a kilometer high. And you have automated industries that are there at the base. The idea, of course, is again utopian, like the utopian imaginations that existed earlier of a world where everyone is fulfilling their entire lives, nobody needs to work, that kind of imagination. Another such city, and what is interesting is the way that he does comparisons between New York and the city that they are proposing, which is called hexahedron. So while New York has only 82 people per hectare, he has like 2,900 people per hectare. So you see this. This is the way that the city itself is imagined. This is hexahedron and the way that it's put together. This freestanding on these columns with this landscape that is left relatively untouched. And he has a drawing of the Empire State Building right beside it to show you the height of it. I'm just going to show you a few more images. This is hexahedron in the city. I just chose some at random. So this is Babel. And when I see these, I can't help but think about the scale at which people were thinking about the world at that time. All of these, whether that's Archigram, Yonah Friedman, the Situationists, there seems to be an attempt to create a massive imagination within which individual freedom can lie, ecological sensitivity can lie. This is the section, external edge, this whole interior space that rises up, commercial areas below, public areas, all the way up to the top where the cultural center is. Well, they tried to build one of sorts. This is called Arco Santi, somewhere in Arizona. They built part of Paolo Soleri's imagination as a city called Arco Santi. It has a few workshops and a few places of living. It was never completed. It's I don't even know whether it's completely inhabited. This is the way that it looks. This is how it was imagined in its entirety, where the size of people is like itnu sa chota. But what was actually built is very little of that. This is the plan. You have an amphitheater here, greenhouses for the food. And this itself is the city. And these are the later phases of growth that were imagined for the city. This is what the entire plan was supposed to be. This is the area that was first built, and these were later phases of development. Only this much was built, none of the others exist. And as you can see, what primarily exists are artistic and cultural facilities, along with Paolo Soleri's office itself, and a little bit of housing. Very, very little bit of housing was built. Proposed sections. This is the portion that is built. This is the office, Soleri's office within. This is the primary archway where you enter the colony. It's a desert area, so you have all these concerts and things that happen here. This is the place where they build things, crafts, interiors, spaces. It's all this sort of idealistic hippie culture type of thing. It gives me the vibe of that. Aerial views, internal spaces of the mess, the cafe, as it were, and the construction of these domes and walls upon which people are hanging around doing things, parties, etc. The amphitheater. That's it actually for today. We've been so far in the semester. We started off with ideas from the Black Mountain College. We saw the work of Alto and Khan. We saw all of these guys. We saw the Situationists. We saw Team 10, Japanese Metabolic, Team 10 in all its different avatars. Peter and Alison Smithson, Giancarlo De Carlo, Aldo Van Eyck, Hermann Hertzberger. Then we looked at Japanese metabolism, and we've just finished with looking at Archigram and the sort of playful, entertaining, amusing architecture that was built or imagined by them. Next week, we'll be going down here to looking at an entire movement that really looks at the idea of the vernacular. And we'll be looking at this book by Bernard Rudovsky, which is called The Architecture Without Architects, and looking at some other practitioners as well. After which we'll look at two of the important texts for architecture that happened in the period, 1966, in that 1 year, Robert Venturi's Complexity and Contradiction and The Architecture of the City by Aldo Rossi. And I think that will be the end of this semester, is my feeling. Okay. That's all for now from me. Shirish, you want to add something?
Important for
last project का नाम क्या था?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
I'm thinking that one of the things for everyone to remember is the period of post-war, where for example, when we were earlier talking about the Situationists, right? The idea that a certain kind of I'm using the word efficiency again because I feel that post-war reconstruction demanded a certain kind of efficiency and a pace of rebuilding the cities and towns, okay, and which in fact was created conditions of stiflement for people who were looking for a different kind of a freedom and a different kind of a world. And I think it is in that search that many of these projects emerge. The idea of liberation, the idea of freedom, and I think it's important for everyone to remember that context in which this reconstruction happens. All of these experiments are actually coming out of that trauma of the war, is what I'm thinking. Yeah.
If there are no immediate sort of things, I think we'll ask Behela, Kanchan, Aparna, and Shreya to pick one person for next class. And
Shravan and Sham have some.
Shravan and Sham, if you have questions, please. Yeah.
From last time.
Okay, sure.
So the thing about the sort of idea of spectacle is, I just want to question how we as architects still kind of, use this idea of the spectacle. Because yeah, you're right when you're saying the social media only reflects a fraction of what the content actually is. But on the same time, if you look at architects, like a preface against my biases, I heavily kind of disagree with a lot of the ideas of hypothesis schemes. Because when you sort of over design a space, like, some people treat space like, oh yeah, it's just a spectacle because it's only aesthetic and there's nothing else about it. But there's so many other spaces that are over designed. Like, I think Peter's Zumthor's Therme Valves, for example, everything is so over designed. It's like kind of in your face. Like, yes, every experience must be curated, but why? Why can't we just let some things? I don't think that's an appropriate word to use in class. But like, why can't? And I don't think it means what I think it means. What the way I'm using it. But why can't some things just be kind of experienced chaotically, randomly? Why does everything have to be controlled? Like, don't control the wind entry. Maybe let the wind change with the season.
Yeah, I think that's a point. In fact, the idea of spectacle and modern, or I'd say contemporary architectural practice are very closely intertwined. Is when one thinks about, because spectacle also is about your own signature style, your own identity. Spectacle has been used by entire cities to gain audiences, like Bilbao, where they asked Frank Gehry to build this strange building so that suddenly Bilbao is in the international map, and they call it the Bilbao effect. So the idea of spectacle and architecture are very closely related to each other. For better or worse, I'm not very certain. That's really where you're coming from. But sometimes spectacle can just itself eat architecture entirely until architecture doesn't have any space to be except become part of that entire spectacle. Absolutely, like Shravan. Dubai too is part of that same this. The interesting thing to explore is the relationship between spectacle and capitalism. I think that would be an important thing to really think about. Sham, you had some questions?
एक कमेंट आहे आणि माय क्वेश्चन आहे. तर
बोल.
हा तर असं मला वाटतं की आपल्या अवतीभोवती असे खूप सारे प्रोपोगंड आहेत की ज्यांना आपण अवॉइड करू शकत नाही. तर इन्सेप्शन मूवी मधला एक असा अॅनॉलॉजी आहे की त्यात कसं होतं की ते एका स्वप्नातून उठतात, मग त्यांना कळतं की दुसऱ्या स्वप्नात उठलेत, मग त्या स्वप्नात उठतात त्यांना कळतं आणखीन एका स्वप्नात उठलेत. तसं मला वाटतं आपल्या शेजारी असे एक बबल्स आहेत प्रोपोगंडाचे. आपल्याला वाटतं की अरे चल देवावर विश्वास ठेवायच्या का बबलमधून मी सुटलोय, मग आपल्याला कळतं की आपण नॅशनलिनच्या बबलमध्ये अडकलोय, मग आपण तो बबल फुटतो, मग आपल्याला कळतं आपण आणखीन कोणत्या एका बबलमध्ये अडकलोय. तर असे माझ्यामध्ये सिरीज ऑफ बबल्स आहेत, म्हणजे स्वप्न आहेत, आणि आपण असं कधीच पूर्ण उठणार नाहीये. आणि जरी आपण पूर्ण उठलो तरी आपल्याला कळणार नाही आपण जागेत आहेत का. असं त्यात तो सीन आहे ना की ती जी ऍक्ट्रेस असते तिला माहितच नसतं की ती आता उठली आहे, संपूर्ण रियालिटीमध्ये आली, आणि ती खरंच सुसाईड करते, ती मरूनच जाते. म्हणजे आपल्याला ती माहितच नाही की ती प्रोपोगंडाची चेन कुठं सुरू झाली, आपण ती कधी संपू शकतो का. आणि मग मी असा विचार करत होतो की अशी काही थ्रेड आहे का की आपण असं शोधू शकतो की सगळ्यात पहिला प्रोपोगंडा कोणता होता, की कुठून हे डायव्हर्जन सुरू झालं. असा एक माझा पहिला प्रश्न होता. आणि दुसरा प्रश्न असा होता की हे जे माणसं असं फ्रीडमसाठी मागतात वगैरे किंवा असं भांडतात, म्हणजे चांगलं आहे, तुम्ही जर तुमची आयडिया प्रोपोगेट करतात दुसऱ्यांच्या भल्यासाठी तर चांगलं आहे, पण खरंच फ्रीडम दुसऱ्याकडे मागायची गोष्ट आहे का. म्हणजे तुम्ही स्वतःमध्ये फ्री असाल तर तुम्हाला गरज आहे का दुसऱ्याकडे फ्रीडम मागायची. म्हणजे हे जे वर्कर्स राईट्स किंवा लिबर्टी वगैरे मागणारे माणसं आहेत, ह्याच जगामध्ये एक जागा आहे ना ऑरोविल नावाची, जिकडे माणसं असंही ते सगळे फ्रीडम एन्जॉय करतात आहेत कारण ते स्वतःमध्ये लिबरेटेड आहेत, त्यांना गव्हर्नमेंट वगैरे काही फरकच पडत नाही. असा एक क्वेश्चन होता.
No, but good question, very very good question. कि पहिला आहे the nature of reality ना. तर तुझा first question तो आहे nature of reality काय आहे. आणि I mean this is not it's one of those questions that has plagued humanity across time. It's a philosophical question. At what point are we real? What point are we image? When we look at ourselves, are we looking at ourselves as real? Are we looking at ourselves in the way that we see ourselves? Is our experience real, or are we actually only imagining our experiences? At what point do we begin and what point do we end? And especially now when we are living in this digital era, is my Facebook page me, or is my Facebook page a representation of me? At what point when people say things on my Facebook page, are they saying things to me, or are they saying things to my Facebook page, right? So the nature of where our bodies begin, our bodies ends, where our presence begins and where our presence ends, is an interminable complex question. I don't think I can or anyone can really give you an answer to that question, because it really concerns a fundamental question of life. Which brings me to actually the second question. I'll try and answer at least part of the second question. So it leaves you with this feeling कि कभी कभी ऐसे भी हो सकता है ना कि अगर सब कुछ माया है फंडामेंटली, ठीक है, तो जीने की जरूरत ही क्या है, कि जीने का मतलब क्या है, वो प्रॉब्लम हो जाता है. लेकिन ये जो है सर्च फॉर ट्रूथ, सर्च फॉर ऑथेंटिसिटी, वो एक पर्पस हो सकता है जिंदगी का. दूसरा पर्पस जिंदगी का ये भी हो सकता है कि हमारे पास जो है, हमारे साथ जो है, हमारे ये हमारे सामने जो है, हमारे, that we do the best that we can for everything around us, for the people that we love. We try and make the world a better place for everyone around us, because making people more free, making a world that is gentler on the environment, gentler for people who are marginalized, is just something that we should be doing, because we just, in many ways care for each other. So there are two ways in which one can look at what one's purpose in life is. One is that the search for purity and the search for truth. Okay. And that is, of course, where many people get very obsessed about. Okay. I want to find out the truth, and that is an interminable journey, and I don't know whether anyone has ever been able to find out the truth. Okay. Including the great religious leaders, the great philosophers, they're all speculating about what the truth is. And sometimes they try to do it in very violent ways with other people, and sometimes very violent ways to themselves also. Okay. And still very often they don't necessarily find the truth. It's an interesting purpose to have, I think, and one always needs to kind of know that it's important to keep a philosophical question in mind when one is living in the world. That is my opinion. But given that, I'm also thinking that we also in many ways have a responsibility to not necessarily care for what is far away and distant, but care for very simply what is around us. Sham, you are in a particular place with your parents and brothers, sisters, cousins, whoever. I am in my place with my brothers, sisters, whatever. I have my own life, right? And there are students that are there around me, and the community that's there around me. I live in a city, and there are, in that sense, mundane, everyday things that are there around me. And I think that to give my life fulfillment, or our lives fulfillment, there are gestures of love and caring that we reach out to everyone around us. And that gives us meaning as well. So there are two ways in which one can think about the idea of meaning. One is at the more everyday level, and one is at this transcendent level. Architecture can, and people can reach out to people around us. So when people are talking about questions that are like these abstract ideas of freedom, liberty, all of these things, I think it comes from the fact that they genuinely believe that that creates a better life for people. It's a struggle that they are doing not only purely for selfish reasons, but they are doing it because they believe in the value systems that can create a more fair and a more loving society. And that is what they are trying to do. They are trying to, in that sense, continue to be generous and giving to those around themselves to make their lives better. Does that answer your question, Shyam?
Yes. हाँ अभी थोड़ा मुझे खुद भी सोचना पड़ेगा।
हाँ, वो आंसर तो है नहीं, लेकिन मैं डिस्क्रिप्शन है, ठीक है।
वो लास्ट प्रोजेक्ट का नाम क्या था? वो मैंने देखा नहीं।
लास्ट का
अभी
कौन?
जो स्क्रीन शेयर करते हुए जो लास्ट प्रोजेक्ट था उसका नाम नहीं चाहिए।
आर्को शांति। ये देख, पाउलो सोलेरी का काम देख, पाउलो सोलेरी, ठीक है। If there's nobody else, then Arham, Bhakti, Kshama, and Soumya for next week. Arham?
I do have one small kind of point. It could be an interesting coincidence or a very kind of clever design choice on the part of the creators. But we all know Cobra has been like a sort of anti-Marxist kind of congregation, right, so to speak.
Who?
So Cobra, we were studying Cobra last week.
Not anti-Marxist. Did I say they were
It is Marxist, sorry, anti-capitalist and Marxist. Right,
Yeah.
I'm very sorry about that. So yeah, anti-capitalist Marxist kind of congregation. So it's interesting if, like, because the G.I. Joe villains, and G.I. Joe was this kind of American imperialism, capitalism for the win, that kind of group.
Cobra.
Yeah.
Yes. It's just hilarious that they share the name, and the creators could have done their research and like thrown it in there.
Very possible, sir. Very possible. Anyway, chalo. My voice is gone. I'm supremely tired. Okay. I'll see you guys later. And okay, Arham, Bhakti, Kshama, and Soumya, can you guys just please turn your cameras on? I want to see your faces. Hi, Arham. Hi, Kshama. And who else is there? Bhakti and Soumya. Hi, Bhakti. Bhakti Jain. 2 Jains. How many Jains in your class? Kshama Jain, Bhakti Jain, Arham Jain. ये Jain 3 Jain हो गए आज. We need to get you guys some non-vegetarian food now. And where's Soumya? Why Soumya is not there? नहीं है Soumya. Soumya. As if by shouting I'll be able to call her out. It's like the most stupid thing I just did actually. Soumya, कहाँ है तू?
Soumya is not in the meeting actually. She lost connection in the middle and she was trying to rejoin.
Arham, so tell me, where are you from?
Matanali, Mumbai.
And Kshama?
I'm from Ludhiana, Punjab.
Hi. Are you in Ludhiana right now?
Yeah,
Man, I've never been to Ludhiana.
you should. It's an amazing city.
I can imagine. I think every city is amazing, but the only cities I've been to in Punjab are Chandigarh and Amritsar. And
Oh,
Amritsar
I live.
amazing.
Yeah, I mean, I have relatives in both the cities, Chandigarh and Amritsar. So it's like every month I go.
It's amazing. I love Amritsar. And Bhakti, where are you from?
I'm from Shirpur. It's near Dhule in Maharashtra.
Near Dhule, Shirpur. Shirpur. Ami Shirpur se. I do the worst Marathi accent ever. I'm just saying. People make fun of my Marathi accent. It's a joke. My sister constantly is teasing me. Rohan, Marathi बोलता है? I said, हाँ, मैं मराठी बोलता हूँ. मैं मराठी बोलता हूँ. In that horrible Marathi. Very, very fake Marathi accent. Very, very bad. Okay. So remember one thing, as far as the responses are concerned, please don't give us general gyan. Try and take some of the ideas within the lectures and look at things that you are familiar with or that you have already seen. And there may be a film that you have seen, or maybe there's a place that you've been to, or maybe there's another idea that you're interested in, or something that you've seen in some other lecture. Let's try and expand the conversation. You don't need to repeat the lecture to us, and don't give me full gyan. Okay? You don't have to appear very gyani. I don't expect you all to have done philosophy. So you don't need to come and tell me all that gyan. I'm more interested in you being honest to who you are. Okay, and taking these ideas and trying to look at your lives through that. Okay. Shirish, or kuch? Are we done?
On Friday, let's sit and
Film list.
give out the films and the student groups. So at least we can start. Yeah. Okay.
Okay, chal. Bye, guys.
Bye, guys. Bye.
Weren't we supposed to make our own groups? I think some of us have already.
You all can make your own groups.
Yeah.
You can make then send us the groups.
We'll do that. We'll create an Excel sheet and send.
Pairs.
Can we do it tomorrow
So
after
they're
the
pairs. Yeah.
jury? I'll see.
Pairs. Two people.
Pairs. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Tomorrow after
So we
jury is
can do it
fine.
tomorrow. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah. Sure. Bye.
Thank you.